Well, the story of the Old West is a very, very colorful and romantic period of history. It's why I was captivated by it as a child, and lots of other people have been. It's just a great story, and the characters are larger than life, and of course the forces that they were up against seem so incredible. And they actually become, I think for Americans especially, almost a creation myth, like the ancient Greeks had the story of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece, or the English had King Arthur and Camelot. This is how a nation forms an identity. And one of the most difficult things for a nation of immigrants and for a new nation, and we're both, is that we had no identity. Who are we?
The Wild West, a land of endless opportunity, but also lawlessness. A place where freedom came with risk and survival depended on more than just grit. It was here on the frontier that America was forced to answer some of its most pressing questions. Who has right to the land? Who enforces the law? And what responsibilities come with expansion? This wasn't just a time of cowboys and cattle drives. The Wild West forced the U.S. government to take on new responsibilities, establishing law and order, defining property rights, and ensuring justice. At the same time, individuals had to balance their newfound freedoms with their obligations to society. The legacy of the Wild West isn't just about the past. It's about the rights we defend and the responsibilities we carry out today. The West was a land of promise, but it was also a land of conflict. As settlers pushed westward, the U.S. government had a responsibility to maintain order in a vast and sparsely populated frontier. But at what cost? The Homestead Act of 1862 promised land to settlers, granting them the right to own and develop property. But this right also carried out responsibility to cultivate the land, to contribute to growing communities, and for many, to defend their claims for rival settlers or hostile forces. For Native American tribes, the westward expansion was a direct challenge to their own rights. The U.S. government tasked with keeping peace often failed to protect Native sovereignty. Treaties were broken, settlers seized land, and conflicts erupted. The responsibility of government clashed with the desire for expansion, raising questions that still echo today.
So you should know, was it tougher or easier to enforce law in your days?
Much tougher.
Well, because there was more crime?
No, there was lesser crime. The people were more honest. You could leave a poke of gold in your home and leave the door wide open. It was as safe as in a bank vault.
Well, then why was the job tougher?
Well, because you were the arresting officer. You took every responsibility on yourself. You're arresting officer, detective, squad car, jailer, and the whole thing wrapped up in one.
The law and order were not easily enforced. In the early years, justice in the West was improvised. Vigilante groups and private militias often took it upon themselves to punish criminals. This raised a dangerous question. Who had the right to enforce the law? As towns grew, local sheriffs and marshals, some famous, some infamous, became responsible for upholding justice. Figures like Wyatt Earp, Bass Reeves, and Pat Garrett set the precedent for modern law enforcement, proving that justice had to be fair, but also firm. Yet justice in the West wasn't always fair. Racial discrimination, corrupt officials, and personal rivalries shaped the law just as much as written statutes. The responsibility of governing a wild land often fell into the hands of those who sought power rather than justice. One example of this was the controversial trial and execution of Tom Horn, a hired gun who was accused of murdering a 14-year-old boy. The evidence against him was questionable, and many believe he was a scapegoat for powerful cattle barons trying to maintain control over Wyoming's open range. His case remains one of the Wild West's most debated miscarriages of justice. Similarly, the Dodge City War in Kansas demonstrated the constant power struggles between lawmen and outlaws. In 1883, a group of rival businessmen and gunfighters attempted to seize control of the town, leading to a tense standoff. Wyatt Earp himself was called in to resolve the situation, highlighting the fragile balance between law and disorder on the frontier. And then Hollywood arrived. Western films immortalized the Wild West as a world of noble lawmen and ruthless outlaws. The six-shooter duels, the lone cowboy standing up for justice, these stories painted a picture of individual heroism. But real justice in the West was much more complicated. In reality, the balance between rights and responsibilities was constantly shifting. Settlers had the right to move west, but at whose expense? Outlaws claimed the right to defend themselves, but what were the limits of personal justice? And how did the government manage its responsibility to maintain order while ensuring individual freedoms? Films like High Noon depicted the lonely sheriff forced to defend justice against overwhelming odds, while The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance questioned whether myth was more powerful than reality. Tombstone dramatized the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, while The Wild Bunch explored the brutal violence of frontier justice, challenging traditional Western ideals.
If they move, kill them.
Westerns shaped how we see American values: freedom, independence, justice. But they often ignored the responsibilities that came with those values. Take property rights. The idea that land could be owned, fenced, and defended was not universal before European settlement. Native Americans viewed land as something shared, not possessed. The West forced the government to define property laws in ways that still affect land disputes today. The Johnson County War of 1892 was a prime example of this tension. Wealthy cattle barons hired gunmen to eliminate small ranchers they accused of rustling cattle. The conflict escalated to a point where the U.S. cavalry had to intervene, demonstrating how the struggle over land and justice could erupt into violence at any time. So why does the Wild West still matter? Because it was the ultimate test of rights and responsibilities. It was a time when settlers claimed new rights, but had to prove they could handle the responsibilities that came with them. When the government had to establish order without overstepping its bounds. When justice was not just a system, but a personal duty. And those lessons didn't end with the frontier. They still shape our laws, our culture, and our understanding of freedom today. The Wild West wasn't just a time period. It was a proving ground for a young nation. It was a place of lawlessness and lawmaking, of myth and reality, of brutality and opportunity. It was a world where rights were fought for, responsibilities were tested, and history was written with every step forward. And that history, it's still being written today.